So today we're going to be breaking down a dark sounding melody for someone like Toliver inside of FL Studio. So for the first sound in the melody, I went into Keyscape and grabbed a piano. So I grabbed the Wing Upright Lonely Basement, and I went ahead and turned up the release noise and the pedal noise just to give the piano a little bit of extra texture. So here's what that ends up sounding like. So then here's what the MIDI for that ends up looking like, and overall it's pretty simple and just uses 2 chords in a 4-1 progression. So if I were to go ahead and make something similar, I would start off on the 4 of the scale that I'm in, so in my case that's G sharp, and then build a triad from there. And then go down to the root note of the scale and do the exact same thing. So we don't really have that dark sound for these chords yet, so we're going to make a few changes. So we're going to go ahead and move this D sharp down an octave, and then also put this F sharp down to an F, just to get that darker sound. So that's pretty much it for the chords, so I'm going to go ahead and copy it up 2 octaves just for later so I can use these same notes on the top line, and we'll just lower the velocities to 0 and add some more things to the chords. So to make the chords sound a little bit more interesting, I like to add in the notes next to each other in the scale. So I'm going to add in this A sharp here, I'll add in an F and an F sharp here, and also an F on the first chord. So right away, now this melody is sounding more dark and eerie, and to really just finish off the chords, we're just going to select them, do Alt-S to strum, Alt-R to randomize the velocities, and we're going to want to go pretty aggressively here, Alt-X to bring all the velocities down so the chords feel really soft. So that's pretty much it for the chords, and then we can go back up and work on the top line. So we're just going to grab the notes from the bass triads and then just kind of move them around to make a very basic and repetitive top line. And then we can select that and use Shift D to make it a little bit more plucky. So now if we go back and look at the normal MIDI, you can see that we have those same chords that I just made, but I went ahead and stretched it out a bit. So the first 4 bars of the entire pattern is just using the G sharp chord, and then the second 4 bars is using the D sharp chord. And then I went ahead and added in slight variations to those chords just to make it a little bit more interesting, but not make it super overbearing where something is always changing. So the only things that I switched up with the chords were inverting these notes up an octave, and then also putting this A sharp up an octave. And then finally for the top line, I did the exact same process that I showed you, but the timing in this one is just a little bit different. And then I took out the first notes the second time it repeats, again just for a little bit of variation, but not too much. So then I ended up rendering that out, but I added some effects before I did. So I started off with the baby comeback delay with the analog flavor, Portal on the jittery tape preset with the mix turned down to 20%, tape cassette 2 with the wow and the flutter turned up, and then finally a fruity compressor on the vintage preset. Really for these effects, I was just looking for things that would add very subtle imperfections to the sound. So looking for things like wobbles, stutters, delays, maybe glitches, something to just mess with the sound just a little bit so it didn't sound perfectly played. So then finally, once that was rendered out, I went ahead and pitched it down an octave, and then I chopped it up to make it a little bit more interesting. So I went ahead and chopped it and then turned the declicking mode to smooth, and then dragged all of the chops back a little bit so the melody almost has a pulsing feel to just add a little bit of movement. Finally, I added 2 additional effects that are automated. So I started off with Portal again on the jittery tape preset, and then a gross beat on the tremolo fast preset. So then moving on to the next sound in the melody, I went ahead and grabbed the classic nylon guitar from Omnisphere. So here's what this ends up sounding like. So then for the MIDIs for that, I actually have 2 because I separated them out and rendered them separately. So the first one just covers the top line of the piano melody, and I just went ahead and copied it exactly and then added in the bass notes. And I have this one playing at a higher octave than the second MIDI, just so there's some separation. So one is a bass line melody and then one is for the top line. And then here's what the second MIDI looks like. And like I mentioned, this one is at a much lower octave, and it just copies the bass notes, and I went ahead and chopped it up just to give the melody a little bit more rhythm. The only other thing I added was these these little transition notes, just a transition from the G sharp to the D sharp, make it just a little bit of smoother of a transition. So then for the effects on those, I went ahead and rendered out through the same mixer channel with the portal and the delay on it, and I only added 2 additional effects. So I added an EQ just to boost the mids, and then an EQ just to cut the lows. So then for the next sound, I went ahead and grabbed a synth brass preset from Analog Labs just to fill up the background of the melody. So here's what that ends up sounding like. So then here's the MIDI for that, and overall it's pretty simple and it just copies the exact chords from the piano pad. The only change I made was removing all of the chops and just having the chord hold for 4 bars at a time, so it's a lot more simple, and I just use this to fill up the background of the melody. And then for the effects on that, I didn't put any because I thought the preset sounded really good as it is. So then moving on to the next sound in the melody, I made a choir stack from vocal presets from Omnisphere. So I started off with the classic soprano O's preset, and then the pop female vocal wash 1. So here's what those sound like once they're combined together. So then here's the MIDI for the Sopranos preset, and overall it's very simple and it just copies the bass triads of the chords. So I just went ahead and pitched up the middle note just to give it a little bit more range and make it feel a bit more full. The only other thing I added was the transition notes that kind of make it go down the scale, then hitting at the lower chord, then kind of bringing it back up. Overall just making the transition just a little bit smoother. And then for the pop preset, I just went ahead and copied the top notes of those chords along with the transition notes just to kind of fill up the high end, since this was a higher sounding preset. So then I went ahead and rendered those out together, but I went ahead and added some effects before I did. So I went ahead and started off with fruity reverb with the pre-delay and the decay turned up, then vocal synth 2 on the octave grit preset with the mix turned to 50%, then a fresh air with the mid and high air turned up, and then finally an EQ just to cut all the lows. So then moving on to the final sounds in the melody besides the bass, I went ahead and combined 2 one-shots together to kind of make a top line. So I started off with a synth called Nemo, and then I grabbed another one-shot called Vibes from a Mellotron one-shot kit. So here's what these sound like once they're layered together. So then starting off with the MIDI for the Nemo synth, overall it's pretty simple and it just copies the bass triad from those chords going up and down the scale, and that just repeats. The only thing that I did that was a little bit different besides just repeating that the whole time was I repeated it over 4 times and then have the velocity decreasing, so it almost sounds like kind of a delay. The only variation I have in this pattern is besides the second half copying the second chord, I went ahead and moved the middle notes of all of them down 1 for the second time they repeat. So instead of this being at B, it's at A sharp. Instead of this being at F sharp, it's at F, just to kind of switch it up a little bit, but again, not really doing too much with it. So moving on to the MIDI for the Vibes one shot, again, it's super simple and it's just 2 little notes, and I just have it doing a little chopped riser into 1 hit. So what I do to get these little chops is just putting down a note, making sure it's the right size, doing Alt-U to chop it up, picking whatever size I want, and then holding right-click on the velocities and dragging down to get a smooth and even sweep. So then moving on to the effects for those, starting with the Nemo synth, I went ahead and just added fruity reverb with the pre-delay and decay turned up just a bit, and then a magic switch with the mix turned to 50%. And then moving on to the Vibes one shot, I have a lot more effects on it. So I started off with Valhalla Supermassive on the carousel preset with the mix turned down to 50%, Deep Blue Crusher with the reduction at 5 samples and the smoothing at 100%, Fruity Fast Distort on the fuzz preset with the mix knob automated, Fruity Reverb with the delay and the decay turned up, and then finally an EQ just to cut a little bit of the highs and all of the lows. So then moving on to the final sound in the melody, besides all the textures, I just wanted to add in a bass, so I grabbed a bass one shot from one of Holy's kits. So here's what that pattern ends up sounding like. So then here's the MIDI for that bass, and overall it's super simple and it just copies the bass notes of the melody. So we have it copying the G and then the D. And the only thing I did was kind of chop it up a little bit to add some breaks and then add some reverse notes. So with one shots, how you make a note reversed is you just want to have a note at no velocity, and that will be at the note that you want it to play. And then you want to have a slide note at full velocity that layers on top of that. So you'll get a slide note that is reversed. It just adds a really subtle and interesting effect, kind of spice up your patterns a bit. So then for the final touch on the melody, I went ahead and added a drum loop, a vocal texture, and a tambourine loop. So here's what those sound like all combined together. So that's pretty much it for the melody, so I went ahead and rendered it out all together, and here's what it ends up sounding like. Alright, so that's going to be pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. I'm pretty happy with how the melody turned out, even though it took me a lot of attempts to record the tutorial. Like, seriously, we're at attempt like 8, 10 right now. It's crazy. It's not looking good. But we got it done. Similar to last time, we had some difficulties with the mouse dying. But yeah, that's going to be pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.